Now, in unmuted mode, I'm really happy to start this session on the consequences of wildlife responses to this desertification and climate change. I'm going to keep this intro very short because we have a wonderful array of speakers, and I want to let them talk. But just in a way of a short introduction, we know for many years that human-induced environmental changes, especially on a large scale like climate change, are altering and changing the behavior and physiology of animals, sometimes in very drastic ways. The aim of this session is to try and understand what could be the consequences of such changes to the biotic community and to the ecosystem. So these will be the three talks that we'll have here. On a technical note, those who enter, please make sure that you mute or pause the players, not in the Zoom, but in the website, okay? So we won't get any feedback. But other than that, I'm very, very happy to introduce our first speaker, Joanne van Baren from University of Rennes. And I think I said it correctly, more or less. And she'll talk to us about behavioral and physiological responses of insects to climate change and consequences at the community level, the example of a host parasitoid system in cereal field. Joanne. Wait, you're still muted? Let me
activate.
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon. So I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me, and in particular, Dr. Odile Berger-Thal. So he will give the title of my presentation. So the most insect species are affected by human-induced rapid environmental changes, IREC, which include variable threats like climate change, habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, human harvesting, and pollution. The species can respond to IREC as to any other environmental changes through plasticity, genetic evolution, or dispersal. Climate changes, which are characterized by an increase in mean temperature, but also night warming, winter warming, and an increase of extreme events, can act directly on the life history traits of individuals. For example, in insects, we can observe the impact of temperature on longevity, fecundity, dispersion, trade-off between these traits, diapause strategy, endosymbiont community, immune response to host defenses, or modification of behaviors like sensitivity to odors or behavioral thermo-regulation. The combined impact of these individual effects for species within a community can affect the whole community in two ways. Firstly, between species at a trophic level. For example, the prey-predator or the host-parasitoid relationship can be affected. Or secondly, the communities can be affected by a modification of the relationships between species at a non-trophic level, with modification to interspecific competition, which can modify the relative abundances of different species. In the first part, I will speak about the evolution of overwintering strategies under winter warming, then about the plasticity of thermotolerance capacities of species which remain active during the winter. Third, about the interest of increasing habitat and plant diversity to increase insect resilience to winter warming and therefore to increase biocontrol efficiency. And in the last part, about the interest of gradient studies to predict the impact of climate changes on biocontrol service. In my lab, we are working on a small guild of aphid parasitoids, attacking mostly 3 species of aphids in cereal fields. The second guild of arthropods that we are studying are the ground-dwelling predators that we can find in cereal fields, including carabid beetles, rough beetles, and spiders. We are working on the long-term ecological research armoric an area in Brittany, France, with contrasting agricultural landscapes from open intensive fields to bocage characterized by smaller fields surrounded by hedges. Faced with the seasonal variations in temperatures, there are different possible strategies. Winter can be evaded by migration, as seen in the monarch butterfly, or resisted either by diapause, which is a developmental arrest in response to environmental signals, mainly photoperiod and temperature. On this picture, you can see diaposing aphids in pine needles. Another winter resistance strategy is the ability to maintain activity thanks to physiological thermotolerance due to the production of cryoprotectants or behavioral thermo-regulation. For the first part, the evolution of overwintering strategies under winter warming, we first observe an increase in mean temperature from the 50s to nowadays, but most importantly, a strong decrease in the number of icy days during the winters since 1990. For the parasitoids, we have sampled the mummies during the winters in several fields. This was done each year since 2009. All the mummies were kept in the lab until parasitoids emergence, and the aphid host and the emerging parasitoids were identified to build food webs. If mummies did not emerge after 15 days in the lab, the mummies were dissected, and diapause is recognized when there is a living yellow larva inside the mummy. And since the winter 2015, we decided to check if other species are affected by the disappearance of icy days during the winter in several fields. So we set pitfall traps for ground-dwelling predators in the same several fields in which we collected the mummies. We observe the contents of these traps every 3 weeks during the winters. Here you can see a food web. Below in green are the aphids, above in red are the parasitoids. In gray, in the middle, the relationships. Which parasitoid species is parasitizing each aphid species. The typical winter community of aphids and parasitoids has been known for 30 years. And during the winter, it was possible to find 2 species of aphid which begins to reproduce parthenogenetically during the winter 30 years ago. Among these species, there are the English grain aphid Cytobayon avene and the bird cherry oat aphid Rhopalocyphum paydi. And 2 parasitoid species were also present, Aphidus matricariae and Aphidus rhopalocyphi. The first change was the appearance of a new aphid species, Metopolophium dirodum, during the winter in 2011 in yellow in the picture. The same year, we observed the presence of a new species of parasitoids, Aphidus avene, in light blue during the winter. In the following years, we observe an increase in the number of species present during the winter. There are now always the 3 aphid species and a minimum to 4 to 8 species of parasitoids, including, since 2012, a few individuals of hyperparasitoids, which lay eggs inside primary parasitoids. Therefore, we observe a complexification of the food web and a modification of the relative abundance of the different parasitoid species. And for ground-dwelling predators, for all the 3 studied groups, we observe active individuals moving from grassy margin to fields and vice versa, each year and at each sampling date, like here in the winter 2016-2017. In conclusion, we observe a more diverse and unstable community. And this new diversity is not due to the arrival of species coming from the south, but it is due to a loss of the diapause strategy. And now we observe the typical winter and spring aphid and parasitoid species together. We also observe more than 50 species of ground-dwelling predators active during the winter, and changes in relative abundances of the species over time, showing that there is a strong interspecific competition. For the second part, it is first necessary to define thermotolerance. Insects, as ectothermic organisms, are greatly influenced by the ambient temperature. Their survival at unfavorable thermal conditions is governed by their intrinsic thermal tolerance, which is also called physiological thermotolerance, and or by their capacities of thermo-regulation. And behavioral thermoregulation is defined as the use of habitat feature to regulate the internal temperature and can be achieved by modification of activity, selection of microhabitats, or use of physical posture. And to test this, we observe the different insect species on a glass tube in which temperature is regulated by ethylene glycol bath, and the tube was placed in a vertical position for aphid and parasitoids and was placed horizontally for carabid species which are unable to maintain themselves on glass. And then we can measure the physiological thermotolerance. We also conducted metabolomic analysis between diaposing and non-diaposing individuals of parasitoids to observe which compounds could be involved in physiological thermotolerance. And we measured the rates of different hormones, such as juvenile or diapose hormones, on different types of cryoprotectants. We obtain a clear separation between diaposing in blue and non-diaposing in pink individuals, showing that the strategy maintaining activity is linked to the production of particular molecules which could act as cryoprotectant. I have not the time to show you the behavioral experiment, but in conclusion, at the community level, we observe that for the different species of aphid and parasitoids, there is a landscape effect on physiological tolerance, meaning that there is plasticity in this physiological thermotolerance. And there is no effect of landscape on physiological thermotolerance of carabs, probably because they are mobile and can escape to thermal stresses by behavioral thermoregulation only, which is also a plastic strategy. And the parasitoids are able of behavioral thermoregulation by host manipulation when they are inside the mummy. And the aphids have their own capacities of behavioral thermoregulation. So in conclusion of this second part, maintaining activity during winter seems to be possible by plasticity in the production of cryoprotectants and thanks to behavioral plasticity. However, the study of Gunderson and Stillman showed that plasticity of thermotolerance is generally weak in insects and insufficient to resist to climate changes and therefore to winter warming. And it's probably why we observe a declining population of insects. So for the third part, confronted by this situation and by the general observed decline of insect population, what can we do? Different ecological theories affirm that increasing habitat and plant diversity will increase insect resilience to high rate, and in the case of our research, to winter warming. In particular, it is predicted that an increase of plant diversity will increase the arthropod diversity, which will in turn increase the higher trophic level diversity. We tested this hypothesis in our system of cereal fields by planting flowering strips during the winter around the fields, which can provide microclimatic shelters as the vegetation of the flowering strips is higher, 1 meter high, than the culture in winter just 10 centimeter high, which can provide alternative prey and hosts for predator and parasitoids and nectar resources for parasitoid species. Indeed, here you can see a female of Aphidius parasitoid feeding on the nectar of a buckwheat flower, which can flourish now in winter in Brittany. And for such experiment, we benefited from the fact that there are an increasing number of plant species able to flourish during the winter in the west part of France. Here in January, you can see mustard flowers in a winter cover adjacent to a cereal field. And you see that it's a lot of higher. So we observe that the temperature is higher, the temperature is higher in the flowering strip than in the field and in the grassy margin. And we observe a significant increase in the rate of parasitism at proximity of flowering strip. And the abundance of predators increase in flowering strip compared to the grassy margin, which are more permanent. So conservation biological control is defined as the management of the environment to maximize the effect of natural enemies on pest population. All our studies in Brittany showed that winter warming could benefit to conservation biological control in temperate areas by synchronizing natural enemies and insect pests at the beginning of the crop growth. However, and that is also the winter warming modify a lot the community. The community is modified, but the biocontrol is better. However, can this strategy be expanded to other regions? In the first and last part, we studied the relative abundances of different taxa of pests and natural enemies in different regions inside the European project WoodNet, for which I will show you some preliminary results. Indeed, the biocontrol service is known to be not consistent at different scales, both in time and in space, in different studies. So we try to control that. And for that, we studied biocontrol in 3 regions. So Brittany in blue, west part of France, Hauts-de-France in green, north part of France, and Wallonia in Belgium in pink. And there is a gradient of temperature between these 3 regions. And it's around 1,000 kilometers between the 2 extremities. And we studied that during 2 consecutive years for 3 months each year, April, May, and June in the spring. In each region, we selected 3 levels of landscape complexity, many edges, an intermediate amount of edges, and few edges. And in each studied field, there was a side with a hedge and a side with a grassy margin. And we collected 2 taxa of pests, aphids and slugs, and 3 taxa of natural enemies, parasitoids, carabs, and spiders, at 3 distance, 0, 15, and 40 meters from each side of the field. The mean temperature were different among regions, with Brittany being on average warmer than both Hauts-de-France and Wallonia. As a consequence, degree D accumulated faster in Brittany than in both Wallonia and Hauts-de-France for both years. We found no difference in mean temperature between years during the spring and no difference in pluviometry. A regional effect was found on every taxon. Carabids shower higher abundances in Hauts-de-France, whereas other taxa were more abundant in Brittany. We found a positive effect on the landscape grain on carabid beetles' abundance and species richness, and we found a negative effect on both spider and parasitoid abundances in early to mid-season. And finally, landscape grain had a negative effect on both aphid and slug abundances, especially at high cumulated degree days, meaning that there is an opposite effect on landscape grain on pests from one side and natural enemies from the other side. At the local scale, we found overall the presence of natural enemies was higher towards the middle of the crops, whereas the presence of crop pests was higher close to the borders. and especially close to the edge for slugs. Aphids is the same for each type of border. So we found a better potential for biocontrol in Brittany, probably due to the recent loss of diapause in natural enemies, which induces an excellent synchronization. We also observed a greater abundance of all taxa except carabs in Brittany, probably linked to the higher level of landscape complexity in Brittany than in other regions. The major meteorological difference between the three areas is the cold in winter, which will change with the climate changes. At the local scale, the higher parasitism rate in the middle of the field is probably linked to the fact that the aphids are known to be attracted by the borders, edges or grassy margins, and the better potential for biocontrol through ground-dwelling predators in the middle of the field and close to the grassy margin is probably linked to the fact that these species are species from open area. Therefore, the edges seem to be not favorable to the biocontrol, and they seem to be very favorable to the slugs. Then our study shows that gradient study can allow to predict what will happen in colder areas following temperature warming, as they will have this temperature in a few years. It then becomes pertinent to propose management strategies in order to compensate for the effect of global warming. At the local scale, our study shows a negative effect of edges on biocontrol, but as edges are very favorable to biodiversity in general, of course, we should try to keep them and compensating for their negative effect on biocontrol by settling flower strips between the edge and the field, as our previous studies have shown the positive effect of flower strip on biocontrol. So in summary, our results show that insect winter strategies are quickly modified by winter warming, which induces a massive disappearance of diapause strategy at the community level, and by consequence, an increase of competition between species. And the individual response to climate changes induce strong modification at the community level. And for those species that now remain active during the winter, we observe some plasticity in physiological thermotolerance and some capacities of behavioral thermo-regulation. However, the populations are declining for several reasons, including climate changes, meaning that this plasticity is probably not enough to resist to the rapid modification on environmental conditions. One promising possibility is to help the insect species to survive by increasing the plant diversity at the local field or landscape levels, and gradient studies can help to predict when, where, and with which type of management conservation biological control will be the most efficient. So all these researches were funded by different programs, from European to national ones, and conducted by different PhD students, postdoc researchers, and an efficient team of technician adjuncts from the lab EcoBio, and in strong collaboration with my colleague Cécile Lelanne. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have some questions, I will be happy to answer.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to remove your. Thank you very much. That was great, and timing is perfect. We have about 5 minutes for questions. I'll just technically try to remove this. Shachar, can you remove the spotlight?
I did.
Johnson. Okay. So any questions? You can either write them in chat or raise your hands. We'll unmute you. So I will start by asking a question. Wait, I'm trying also to. Okay, so you talked about agricultural fields and everything, and you showed really large differences in the community and the interaction between pests and their natural enemies. And I'm wondering how much of this, or how much of this translates what are the differences between agricultural fields and natural system, where pests may be called prey because they're not pests there, and natural enemies will be predators. So you have in a natural system, this is a predator-prey relationship, and how, what you found for agricultural field, how much is it relevant, and what does it mean for natural systems, for natural ecosystems? All right, I'm unmuting you.
Okay. The particularities of our system is that it's a system which contains very few species. We have only 3 species of aphid and a maximum of 8 species of parasitoids. But we have more for ground-dwelling predators and spiders. But I think that compared to natural system, it's already a very small community. So it's more easy to study what happens because, as you see, with climate change, the impact of climate change is different for each species of the system. And it's why it is interesting to have this small community, because we can really watch year after year the species which become dominant, the species which is disappearing, and all this modification. After the difference between agricultural system and natural system, I don't know. In Brittany, we don't have really big natural system, just around the fields. And of course, in the forest or in the edges, they are not the same species, but in cereals and in the grassy margin around, we can have the same species.
But if what you're saying is that, and I say that, for another question, Yael, yes?
Sorry, I cannot hear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could you? Thank you very much for your talk. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about behavioral thermoregulation in some of the species that you were looking at.
About the thermoregulation?
Behavioral thermoregulation.
Ah, okay, sorry. Yeah. So, in fact, the mummies, when an aphid is killed by a parasitoid, it becomes a mummy. So the mummy is fixed on the plant and cannot move. But what we have shown is that before the aphid become a mummy, meaning the time between the oviposition of the parasitoid inside the aphid and the time of the mummification, it's around 6 days. When an aphid is parasitized, he will, on the influence of the parasitoid, settle in a very sheltered place. So the thermoregulation of the parasitoid is not the same. The best temperature for the parasitoid is not the same as this from the aphid. So we show that with host manipulation, the parasitoid can influence the choice of place for the mummies. For the carabs, we have done an experiment in an area with different type of soil and the possibility of or not for the carabs to escape or to bury it. And we see that, and that was true for most of the species. They try to bury when the temperature is decreasing. So something like 4 centimeters under the surface of the soil. And also they can escape and they can move between the different parts of their environment. And especially when there is a part with a winter cover with high winter cover with flower and high density and vegetation, and close adjacent, in the adjacent part you have the field with very small vegetation and not dense vegetation, they can move to the flowering part of the environment. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joan, for a great lecture. We ran out of time for question. I saw we have more questions in the chat, and I hope we'll have time at the end. We can to maybe answer these. But this is a time to introduce our second speaker, Ophir Levy from Tel Aviv University. He will talk to us about ecological interactions under climate change, how shifts in vegetation cover may affect desert lizards. Thank you, Ophir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me, Oded. And thanks a lot for attending this meeting, everybody. I'm sorry that we can't meet in person. Usually I move a lot when I speak, when I give talks, so it's a little bit weird for me. But let's begin. So, one of the critical things that animals do is to thermoregulate. So you can see here in these nice examples how animals escape the sun by staying under the trees or finding a shade under the turbine. And without these physical features, the animals will have to go elsewhere to look for other thermal shelters. And the difference between sun and shade can be quite astonishing, actually, as you can see here. And sometimes the sunny habitats should be preferred. But under climate change, when you think about it, as the world is getting warmer and drier, the importance of vegetation cover as a shelter from the sun, as a shelter to animals, might be even higher. And one of the big questions that I tried to answer in my research so far is whether we will ever have the ability to predict the impacts of climate change. And these are some of my studied animals, for example. And I tried to solve this question using computer simulations that in one hand incorporate environmental data, and on the other hand incorporate the ecology and physiology of animals. And the simulation runs and predicts the performance of the animals, such as energy balance, growth rates, and so on. And like in all models, there's always a conflict on the complexity of our models. On one hand, we don't want to include too many details in the models because then it might be hard to build the model and interpret the results. For example, it might not be important to see exactly how the structures of the leaves in these trees when you want to simulate a tree, right? But on the other hand, we don't want the model that is too simple, like this kind of model, because we want to include all the important things in the model. For example, if we go back to ecological modeling, usually what we do is to look at single species. Right? But animals, of course, they don't exist in a bubble. They live in ecological communities, and the environment may affect, other important species. And we need to understand these species, and maybe these species are important for our predictions. So for this talk, I want to change my question a little bit. So instead of asking, can we predict the biological impacts of future climates, I want to ask, can we ignore ecological interactions and still predict the biological impacts of future climates? And today I would like to focus on vegetation cover. I'm going to show some research that we've done in the Judean Desert and what we've learned so far about the importance of vegetation to insects and to lizards. And lizards and insects have direct relationship with vegetation cover, for example, as thermal shelters for thermoregulation. And many insects are also herbivores and feed on vegetation, of course. But importantly, vegetation cover can also indirectly affect lizards, since lizards depend on insects as prey items. So we have here a very interesting representation of an ecological community and ecological interactions between vegetation, insects, and lizards. And deserts are excellent model system for studying the importance of vegetation cover. And looking at this picture, you can ask yourself why there's no vegetation here, but there's actually a little bit here, as you can see here on the right. And they're excellent model system because vegetation at a lot of habitats, it's not very limited. Like if you look here at this Mediterranean habitat, but on desert habitat, they suffer from a very limited availability of vegetation. So you can actually look at animals at different availabilities of vegetation, far from vegetation, close to vegetation, and see what might be the differences in their performance, for example. Secondly, when you look at the desert, like what you can see here, this is the part of the Tzelim River in the Judean desert, and you look at the ground temperatures, you can see that the temperatures can reach pretty high degrees. And vegetation, like here, these dots here, I want to show it to you again. These dots here of vegetation, they can provide some thermal shelter to small animals like insects and lizards. And what's the big deal really about temperatures is that the temperatures can significantly affect the performance of animals, especially ectotherms. And you can see here, for example, how the performance of lizards in this example reaches a maximum only at a small range of temperatures. And if the temperatures are too high or too low, the performance is really, really low. So what lizards and other animals are doing, they thermo-regulate. The availability of vegetation cover allows these animals to thermo-regulate and keep the body temperature at maximal performance. And the lizard, for example, will shuttle between the sun and the shade to maintain a preferred body temperature. But if vegetation is scarce, like in the desert, lizards will have to spend a lot of energy to thermo-regulate. In a previous research published by Sears et al. 2016, they developed a simulation where virtual animals were simulating thermo-regulating in virtual arenas under different availabilities of preferred thermal conditions. Some virtual arenas had 1 preferred thermal patch, some had 4, and some had 16. And the simulation didn't include any competition or predation. That's what's good about simulations. You can take out all these other factors and focus on something that you really want to focus on. And in the simulation, they show that the patchiness of the environment is very important. So virtual animals, they thermoregulate less accurately, and they expanded, they spend a lot of time moving. The distance moved was higher when there's less, when the number of patches was lower. And because they had to move a lot, when the vegetation was scarred, they actually spent a lot of energy just thermoregulating. So, in the first study that I want to show you, my students and I located lizards on the different availabilities of vegetation. And we hypothesized that lizards that live near vegetation will have more energy reserves, simply because they spend less energy for thermoregulation. So we studied the small diurnal desert lizard, commonly known as the small spotted lizard, which exists in the areas surrounding the Dead Sea and other deserts in the south of Israel, shown here on green. And we studied the population here in the Judean desert. And these guys, they're highly adapted to the environment. They can be found in very dry areas with no vegetation. And they can also be found in areas where vegetation is more abundant. And my team, led by a PhD student, Gavin Stark, collected adult lizards throughout the years in different areas with more vegetation cover and areas with less vegetation cover. We collected 46 different individuals in the area. Here you can see some of their locations. This is the Nachal Mishmar study site. We have another study site near the Tzelim River. And for each lizard, we measured the body size and we measured the body mass. And we took the lizard to a small visit in Tel Aviv universities. And we measured the amount of energy reserves, body fat, the amount of body fat that they have. For that, we used the dual X-ray machine that we have here in the university. And we also used the drone to create an RGB map of our study sites. And we use the triangle here. You can see our car, small car here. And we use the triangular greenness index to map the vegetation in the area. So every black pixel here represents vegetation. The resolution of this map is around 3 centimeters, which is pretty high. And for every lizard that we found, we were able to calculate the percentage of vegetation cover at the 10 meters radius. And then we basically compared, we wanted to see how the amount of vegetation cover affects the amount of fat reserves on each lizard. And this is what we found. We found that lizards that live next to more vegetation possess more energy reserves. Here, every point represents a different lizard. On the x-axis is the vegetation cover where the lizard was found. And on the y-axis is the amount of energy reserves. So going back to our hypothesis, we found that the hypothesis was true. Lizards near vegetation have more energy reserves. So we found a direct link, direct relationship between vegetation cover and lizards, at least in terms of energy. The reason might be thermoregulation, but perhaps there's another reason. Maybe lizards basically have more food, more energy next to vegetation because maybe there are simply more insects near vegetation. So we wanted to look at that too. So we developed another study and we wanted to see whether insects are more abundant near vegetation in these areas. And I hypothesized that we will find more insects at areas with more vegetation. And to test this hypothesis, we developed a novel framework of camera traps. We've located time-lapse cameras at different levels of vegetation cover. And in comparison to traditional methods, such as pitfalls, cameras can detect the exact time and conditions when an insect was active. And we wanted to know exactly when the insect was active outside. And we programmed the cameras to take a picture of the ground every minute. And we also recorded the temperature and humidity near the ground using eye buttons at the resolution of 10 minutes. So every time an insect passed near the camera and was captured by the camera, we knew what was the ground temperature and the humidity near the ground. And we took more than 600,000 photos throughout the year. We had to stop the study a little bit because of the Corona crisis. We had the lockdown here in Israel. But this is a large amount of photos. 600,000 photos is a large amount. And to analyze such amounts of photos, we trained an artificial intelligence model to detect insects in the photos. And the model so far has a precision of 80%. And we keep improving it as more training data is collected. And the model here, for example, was able to detect a beetle. The model can also detect crickets and can even detect small ants. And ants are very important for our study system because our lizard, they really like ants, right? So we started analyzing the data by looking at the ants and to see how their activity patterns are affected by temperature and humidity. And this is what you see here. So what you can see in the x-axis is the temperature recorder that was recorded when a photo was taken. And in the y-axis, you can see the humidity that was recorded when a photo was taken. The grade points represent times when no activity, when no insects were detected. And the colored points represent activity times of insects, times where cameras took a picture of ants. And the blue color represent low probability of activity according to our statistical model. We statistically analyzed all these points here for the probability of activity patterns of these ants. So blue color represent lower probability of activity according to the statistical model, and red dots represent higher probability of activity according to the statistical model. And you can see the results for high vegetation cover, where the probability of activity is the highest between around 20 to 40 degrees. And you can also see here the histograms of the different conditions. Here you can see the histograms for temperatures on the top. And on the right side, you can see the histograms for humidity. And the peaks that you see here in the histogram, these are the peaks for activity. So insects prefer a certain amount of temperatures and a certain amount of humidities. And all these results, you can see that this is throughout the whole year. Right? We have the winter here where temperatures are low and humidity is higher, and you have the summer here where temperatures are pretty high and the humidity is pretty low. So we have a lot of information in this one plot. And if we look at what happened under cameras where we're a little bit far from vegetation cover, you can see the huge differences in the colors of the points. So instead of having, if you go back to high vegetation cover, instead of having all kinds of colors from red to yellow and blue, you can see that all the colors here of the dots are blue, which means that the model, according to the data, the model predicted that the probability of activity under low vegetation cover is much lower than the probability of activity for these ants at the high vegetation cover. So this study suggests that vegetation cover is also very important for the abundance of insects. As we hypothesized, we also found some interesting patterns for temperatures and humidity, like I showed you. And it means that, vegetation cover has a major role in this ecological system, right? It has a major role in every ecological system. But what we see here in the desert is that vegetation affected lizards, affected the energy available for these lizards. And it also affected the availability and activity patterns of insects. And it might be that, right now, we still don't know what exactly affected the energy and the fat reserves of the lizard. It might be direct effect of vegetation, and it might be indirect effect of vegetation. But what is sure is that vegetation has a major role in this ecological system for both insects and lizards. So these results take us back to the big question: how detailed should our models be? What are the details, if any, that we can ignore in our models? And if you go back, to the other question, can we ignore ecological interaction and still predict the biological impacts of future climates? The answer, at least for vegetation cover in this system, is no. Yeah, so I would like to thank my collaborators in this project, Professor Wegu and Professor Zigao from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Dr. Liang from, he's right now a postdoc in Princeton, and to all my lab members that led these studies, and to my funding agencies. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ophir. That's great. And we have time for questions. So again, if anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand virtually, because we can't see you in the camera. Or write in the chat. And while people are thinking about doing that, I have a question.
Yeah.
What about seasonal effect? Because I would expect, of course, this to be much more pronounced, at least in Israel, in the summer, and maybe somewhere between less pronounced to maybe even the opposite trend in the. I don't know. The degree depends when did you check that. But the winters are different in terms of the problem of heat.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And what we see for the lizard, at least, is that the amount of the effect of vegetation cover is less pronounced as you go far from the summer. And that's another thing that suggests that maybe the cost of thermoregulation are playing a large effect here, because during the winter, the temperatures are not very high, so they can spend a lot of time in the shade. You don't need to thermoregulate a lot, move between vegetation cover a lot when you go far from the summer.
I was thinking actually about something even more extreme. Maybe when it's cold, okay, maybe they actually need the sun more in order to catch the insects. So it's actually, in a way, the shade is interrupting with their ability to catch insects.
Yeah, that's, when you look at the availability of ants, if you go back to this, so this is the winter here. I know
Okay.
you can see my mouse, but at low temperatures and high humidity, this is the winter, and you can see that the availability of insects is not very high.
Right.
And so they might have less food during the winter. So they, if they go to they will thermoregulate, less, they need less the vegetation, they need more the open areas, and they have plenty of that, right? Mm-hmm. So when you think about the cost of thermoregulation, they are much lower during the winter, or even during, the fall and the spring, than during the hot summers.
Okay, nice. I see that Susan has a question or a comment. As soon as you feel free to unmute and say it.
Thank you. A little bit of a Zoom numpty, and I couldn't find out how to raise my hand. Thank you very much for that really wonderful talk. I enjoyed every minute. And I think an important next step would seem to be disentangling how much of that effect is due to the energy costs of thermoregulation and how much due to the higher prey availability. Do you have any plans for experimental approach to that?
Yeah. So what we want to do next is to actually, take what we have from the drone data and build virtual landscapes for these lizards. We also mapped the three-dimensional representation of these areas. So we know for every single time point and every coordinate, we can calculate the angle of the sun and see exactly where shade it will be and where the direct solar radiation is going to be. We can simulate, for example, the percentage of the area where a lizard can forage, the percentage of the areas where insects can be active based on our, statistical model for insects and what we know about the lizards. So we can do all these things. So that's going to be the next step. Thank you.
Sounds very exciting. Looking forward to seeing it come out in papers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted. Claudia, do you want to ask the question? Claudia Martins? I can unmute you.
Sorry, good morning. For me, it's good morning. Can you hear me properly?
It's hard for me to hear.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, is it better now?
Yes, and if not, I'll try. I know Ophir's speaker is not working that well, so I'll translate if needed, or I'll repeat. Yes.
Okay. If it's possible, I would like to know, Ophir, from you, if you also assessed some behavioral responses of insects or lizards. Please.
Ophir, did you hear?
No.
Did you assess also behavioral responses of lizards or insects?
Behavioral for, you mean behavior for the temperature, behavioral thermoregulation?
Yes, I would.
Yeah, so for the insects, that's what we're trying to do with the cameras. We're trying to see, where they will go at different conditions. Will they be active near vegetation, just to be safe. If it's too warm, they can always escape, the shaded areas. And will they go at, and what conditions will they go to locations where there's less vegetation? And for lizards, it's a little bit complicated. It's a little bit more complicated to do this with cameras, and the lizards are just too small to put transmitters on them, or something where you can actually measure what they're doing. But we do take them to the lab and we try to see what's their preferred body temperatures, and then we can put that maybe back, in computer simulations. Thank you.
Thanks. Ram had a question.
Hello, hi, Dr. Ophir. My question was that would you see or expect, similar trend of activity as seen near the different types of vegetation, high vegetation cover or low? Similar trend in seasonal or perennial water bodies near the within the desert region?
So if I understand correctly, you're talking about seasonal changes in, you're asking about seasonal changes in the availability of vegetation?
Oh, no. I mean the activity of the lizard in and around water bodies in the desert. Will it be similar, the trend, will it be similar to that found near vegetation?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And this desert is pretty dry. I mean, we don't see, we weren't even near any free water resource for these animals. The nearest one was like a few kilometers maybe for a study site. But it might be interesting to to study something like that. Maybe add at the study site which is near a spring or something. But this desert is pretty dry, unless you really go next to the very few springs that are available in this area.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, great.
Yes, I think somebody had a question.
And then it's no, I think it was actually answered.
I think Jean perhaps has a question.
Yeah, Jean. Thank you.
So Jean.
Okay. Ophir, did you observe change in the repartition of the repartition area of the different species of lizard following year, or did you follow just 1 year?
Yeah,
Do you observe change in communities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We only did it for 2019. So we started in the summer of 2019, and we just finished the first year of study. Yeah, so and also, it's one thing that is important to understand in this, the cameras framework is that it's really hard to figure out the exact species. So we're talking about the genuses, like, we had, for example, for the ants, we have the meser genus, and for beetles, we have a different, genus. To actually go and look at every single species, the models, the detection models, it's pretty hard for them to do it right now. We need much more training data, and much more, better resolution of images in order to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really great.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to our third and last speaker for this session, Susan, and you can already share your screen if you want. So our last speaker is Susan Cunningham from University of Cape Town in South Africa, and she'll talk to us about the landscape of heat, behavioral thermo-regulation, which is a common theme here, which makes sense, and its impact in a warming world. Susan.
Well, thank you very much. First, just check that everybody can hear me. I think that I'm unmuted, so thank you, Oded, for inviting me to speak today. So today I really want to talk about endotherms. We've been hearing about insects and lizards so far, so it's time to move on to birds and mammals, I think. And I want to talk about their behavioural responses to the landscape of heat and what those responses might mean for the functioning of dryland ecosystems under climate change. So I want to approach this in two parts. First, talking about how and why endotherms respond behaviourally to rising temperatures and the consequences of that at species level. And I'll have blue headings for that part of the talk. And then I want to talk about a very simple idea about what the implications of this might be for ecosystem function. And I'd really love at the end of this talk to hear about whether you think this idea is a good idea or a crazy idea. Okay, so we can look at this schematically if we think about the impacts of climate change on ecosystem function. And for the majority of the talk, in fact, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking about this from the point of view of temperature, for simplicity really. But I also want to point out before I go further that another component of climate change, of course, is change in precipitation. And we know from some of our work in the Kalahari Desert that drought exacerbates temperature effects and vice versa. So I'm not going to talk about drought further, but I just wanted to note that before we carry on. And I'm showing you a graphic here of some recent work that we did with southern pied babblers, which is that very cute bird at the bottom of the screen, looking at the survival of chicks to 1 year of age with mean daily maximum temperature as a dependent fledgling on the x-axis. And the black line on that graph there shows you the impact of temperature during the time the chick was a fledgling on their survival to 1 year. And the grey line, which I'm just going to highlight in red, shows what that relationship is when there's also a drought. So we're looking at synergistic effects there. Okay, so moving on now. For the last 10 years, I've been working on ideas about how climate change is likely to affect population persistence of desert birds. And we think in my research team that the relationship between climate warming and population persistence looks something like this. So we have impacts of temperature on physiology and behavior, which interact with one another, and then go on to affect survival and reproduction, which then affects population persistence. And so that's the main focus of my research, and I will spend a little bit of time talking to you about some of the outcomes of that, just to set the scene and give you a bit of background to my thoughts about how this might affect ecosystem function. In the first instance, of course, there's a very straightforward, obvious risk of changes in relative abundance of species impacting the way the systems that they're a part of work. But we also think that there's a quite important link between behavioural changes for thermoregulation and ecosystem function. We think this is a potentially critical link, and we think it is currently largely overlooked. Okay, so moving on now to part one, how and why does high temperature affect animal behaviour? To get a handle on this, we're going to do a little bit of endotherm thermal physiology 101, and I'd like to thank both Jean and Ophir for providing some background for this already. And then I'll talk a little bit about landscapes of heat, which again, Ophir has provided some nice background for, and outcomes of behavioural thermoregulation at the species level. I'm going to focus on birds because that's what I work on, but these ideas I hope are applicable across taxa. All right, so this graph here is hopefully very familiar from Ophir's talk, showing the relationship on the x-axis between the body temperature of an animal and its performance on the y-axis. And Ophir showed us some empirical data of various different ways you can measure performance. But the critical thing really to notice here is that all species, whether they're ectothermic or endothermic, have an optimum body temperature range at which performance is maximized. The other thing to note is that the relationship between performance and body temperature is asymmetric. So you have this sort of shallower relationship at the cold end and a very steep relationship at the hot end, which we like to call the thermal cliff. And that's showing that the impact of increasing body temperature on performance is more dramatic. It happens faster as an animal becomes too hot than it does as an animal becomes too cold. And that's to do with denaturation of enzymes and changes in cell membrane structure and irreversible things like that. So the issue with the thermal cliff is that you really don't want to fall off it. And this is what happens when you do. So these two images here are from quite famous mass mortality events. The top picture is of flying foxes in Australia. I think that one everybody knows about. And the bottom image there are Carnaby's black cockatoos, again from Australia. And both of these events happened when air temperatures got too hot for these animals to be able to maintain a safe body temperature, and they therefore fell off this thermal cliff. And in fact, just last week, the same thing happened here in South Africa, over in the eastern part of the country. A colleague of mine in Pongolo Game Reserve sent these photographs to me just yesterday, so I could include them in this talk. All right, so given that the consequences of falling off the thermal cliff are obviously very severe, how do endotherms manage to avoid it? What do? They obviously need to put in a fair amount of effort to maintain a safe body temperature that's critical for survival. Ectotherms like Ophius lizards do this by shuttling from the sun to the shade. The endotherms are defined by their ability to physiologically thermoregulate, and they do so by altering their metabolism and altering their evaporative water loss rates. So this graph here shows you the environmental temperature the animal is exposed to on the x-axis. Important to note that that's environmental temperature and not body temperature. On the y-axis, you've got metabolism of the animal. And you can see that metabolism is higher when it's cold and when it's hot. And then you've got this sort of neutral zone in the middle called the thermoneutral zone, where metabolism is at its lowest than it needs to be for an animal to maintain a safe body temperature. We get increases in metabolism at the cold and hot end because of shivering at the cold end and evaporative cooling at the hot end. Okay, and those increases in metabolism are important because they're creating heat. The other aspect of endotherm thermoregulation is this remarkable ability to effectively evaporate water. And this happens generally as air temperatures or environmental temperatures begin to approach the body temperature of the animal. Because if your environment is hotter than you are, the only way that you can keep cool is by evaporating water. And that's why we see these dramatic increases in evaporative water loss as air temperatures rise. Now, I've just put this photograph of a sociable weaver here on the slide to show you what a bird that's evaporating water looks like. That bird has got its mouth hanging open, panting as it loses heat from its body by evaporation. So this graph here on the left-hand side of the screen shows a schematic of the metabolic rate in orange and the evaporative cooling rate, evaporative water loss rate in blue of a white-browed sparrow weaver, which is the bird at the top of the graph. The picture on the right-hand side of your screen shows you a tree in the Kalahari Desert with 4 temperature data loggers placed around it, showing you the environmental temperature in those different locations at an air temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. So you can see, as Ophir pointed out, that the differences in temperature in different parts of the environment can be dramatic. If you are a sparrow weaver on the ground in this situation, you're experiencing 46 degrees, let's say, and that means that your metabolic rate is a certain level shown by the black arrow, your evaporative water loss is another level shown by the black arrow again. If you move into a shaded location in a tree, you can dramatically reduce your metabolic costs and you can dramatically reduce your water costs. So for an endotherm, behavioural thermoregulation is mostly about reducing these costs of keeping cool, whereas for an ectotherm, it's about managing body temperature directly. Okay, so given the stakes are high, both in terms of your survival and also in terms of your metabolic and water costs, it's not a surprise that endotherms in deserts put a lot of effort into behavioural thermoregulation. In this graph here, we're looking at the probability of a sociable weaver being found in the shade, the probability of it being active. So both of these changes in behaviour are about reducing thermal load. We can also look at that evaporative cooling behaviour of panting, which increases dramatically as air temperatures rise. So behavioural thermoregulation can buffer birds from the costs of keeping cool, but these behavioural changes potentially also carry costs of their own. Panting is an obvious one. It's carrying a risk of dehydration because they're using water when they do that. But all 3 behaviours carry costs in terms of missed opportunities as well. The missed opportunity costs are often underestimated or overlooked. They occur when behavioural thermoregulation trades off against other behaviours, and they can affect fitness and population persistence. And I've got this non-feathered reptile here on the screen. to point out a study by Cernovo et al. In 2010, showing that 12% of local populations of scleroporous lizards, which is what this is, in their study sites in Mexico went extinct between 1975 and 2009 because of the missed opportunity cost for foraging that these lizards experienced when they were retreating into shaded crevices to keep cool. Those costs meant that females could not put on enough body mass in order to breed successfully, which goes to show that a sublethal change in behavior in response to temperature can have a knock-on effect that is important for population persistence. So we've been working on missed opportunity costs and the costs and consequences of behavioural thermoregulation in a large number of bird species over the last 10 years. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about these two. The first case study is the common fiscal or southern fiscal. This is a bird that I worked with for my postdoc. These are shrikes, typical shrikes. So they like to hunt from standing on high exposed perches where they have a good view of the ground and they can jump down and kill things like lizards and insects from those high vantage points. The graph you have here are 4 different types of perches that these birds use. On the left, we have shade, L for low and H for high, and then sun, L for low and H for high. The y-axis is a preference index. Where it says 0, that means that the birds are using those perches in keeping with their availability in the environment. If the box plot is above 0, it means that the birds are preferring those perches and actually actively seeking them out. And where it's below 0, it shows that the birds are actively avoiding them. So these data come from a normal day in the Kalahari deserts, showing that our fiscal shrikes, common fiscals, enjoy best to be on high sunny perches, and that's because of that hunting strategy. However, if air temperatures go above 35 degrees, these birds make a dramatic shift in preference from high sunny perches to high shaded perches, and that allows them to reduce their environmental heat load by about 4 degrees, which can provide very significant physiological benefits for these birds in terms of energy and water savings. However, when they do so, they make a trade-off with their foraging success, because shaded perches tend to be obscured by vegetation, so it's difficult for them to see the prey on the ground to hunt. And their prey capture rate per minute drops dramatically, significantly when they shift into the shade. This affects their ability to provision nestlings. So if birds are breeding, their provisions per hour on cool days are much higher than they are on hot days. And this has an impact on the body mass gain between dawn and dusk of shrike nestlings in the study system. So you can see in this graph, air temperature maximum on the x-axis and body mass gain on the y-axis, showing that shrike chicks who are experiencing air temperatures around 40 degrees are only putting on about 5% body mass per day, whereas those at around 26 degrees are putting on almost 50%. So this does have knock-on effects for these nestlings when they come to fledge from the nest, and these data are for chicks at day 12, shortly before they leave the nest, showing that on the x-axis of the graph on the left, one labeled body mass, you've got each of those dots representing a model of the body mass of chicks based on the number of days above the temperature on the x-axis. Okay, so let me explain this to you using the fledging date graph on the y-axis, similar scenario. What this is telling us is that for each of these, for this one in particular, 1 day above 35 degrees translates to half a day later in fledging. So if you look at the body mass one at the 38 degrees, that's telling us that 1 day over 38 during the nestling period means that the chicks are fledging from that nest about 6 grams lighter. All right. Fledging date one of this graph here is especially important because each additional day in the nest in this environment carries a 4% increase in predation risk. So you have a direct link here to survival and breeding success in these birds. So here we're looking at shade seeking leading to a foraging trade-off, which is leading to a reduction in breeding success. All right, my second case study I want to talk to you about is a superb bird called the fork-tailed drongo. And these birds we were able to work with experimentally using a habituated but wild population in the southern Kalahari. And what we did here is that we experimentally supplied worms to fork-tailed drongos in the early afternoon on days of different temperature, just to disentangle whether those patterns that we were seeing in the shrikes were really due to changes in birds' behavior because of temperature, or whether they were due to changes in the availability of prey. And so what we did with the drongos is fed them experimentally worms by flicking them into the air like this. The bird will fly for the worm. And we did sessions of this in the afternoon on days at different temperatures. And what we found was that the air temperature at the time of the experiment had a significant impact on how willing the birds were to fly for these worms. So the proportion of worms that they simply ignored increased as air temperature increased. Furthermore, if we were working with breeding birds, we found that the proportion of those worms that they caught, that they then went and provisioned to the nest, also decreased as air temperature decreased. And this obviously was independent of changes in prey behavior because we were providing a steady supply of prey to these birds. What this is telling us is that birds fly more reluctantly as temperature increases, and that's presumably in order to keep down the metabolic heat production that they have to deal with. And this suggests that thermoregulatory costs are directly influencing foraging and provisioning, at least in this species. The interesting thing about this study was that when we went to look at the impacts of these changes in adult behavior on the mass of their nestlings at fledging, we found that the mean temperature during the nest period had no effect at all on the size of the chicks that these birds produced, which was really quite a puzzle at the time, because every other bird species we've looked at, we see a decline in fledgling mass with temperature, which makes these drongos an important birds for our study group, because we're really interested in understanding how they do it. And I can present you some preliminary data from this from my PhD students in the field at the moment, showing an interesting behavior which seems to be about compensating for that lost opportunity to forage during hot days. So in this graph here, we've got the daily air temperature maximum on the x-axis and provisioning rate on the y-axis. It's important to note that that x-axis is the hottest temperature that was recorded on that day. So at dawn, if it's going to be a really hot day, drongos will be provisioning their nests at a much higher rate than they will be at dawn on a day that's not going to get very hot. That's what that graph is showing us. At noon, as you would expect from the previous slides, on a really hot day, the drongos are provisioning their nests much less than they would be had it been cooler. And then again at dusk, we see that increase again in provisioning rates on days that have been really hot compared to what they would have been provisioning had the day been cooler. So this looks like the birds are compensating for the missed foraging and provisioning opportunities on hot days by shifting that provisioning behavior to dawn and dusk. So they're making a really significant shift in the timing of that behavior. And shifts in timing is something that Ophir Levy has also been looking at and some excellent work that he's done. So I'm hoping that this slide will be of interest to him. Okay, so why does this matter? Why do we actually care about these changes in behavior in terms of what's happening under climate change for ecosystem function? Well, I would like to suggest that the landscape of heat is an important driver of behavior under hot conditions, and that in fact we can think of it as being analogous to the landscape of fear in terms of its likely impact on ecosystem functioning. So everybody, I think, is fairly familiar these days with this concept of the landscape of fear. And essentially, the idea is that animals shift their behavior in time and space in response to perceived predation risk, and that this has consequences for species interaction and ecosystem function. So the paper that I've highlighted on the slide here is one of the seminal papers proposing this idea. And the graphic that you can see there shows the landscape of fear in terms of predation risk on the y-axis and actual x-y grid coordinates of a real landscape on the x-axis, so that you can see that some parts of the landscape are much riskier in terms of predation risk than others. And prey animals will tend to avoid those predation risk peaks and use areas of the landscape where predation risk is lower. The landscape of fear as a concept suggests that predation shapes ecosystem function by changes in animal behavior and not just by changes in relative abundance. So of course, the very best known example of this is this ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park and what happened there when wolves were reintroduced into that system. So the idea here is that not only did wolves reduce the elk population by eating them, they also forced elk to change their behavior, shifting into different parts of the landscape that were less risky in terms of being caught by a wolf. The knock-on effects of this were increases in vegetation, because of the reduced grazing pressure, and even all the way through to increases in the integrity of stream banks, which changed aquatic ecosystems as well as the terrestrial ones. So it's a famous example. It's been criticized because it's correlative. There is experimental evidence of landscape affair effects at the ecosystem level in other systems. And if you're interested in those, then I'll point you towards this paper here that I've noted on the slide. Okay, so how is the landscape of heat analogous to the landscape of fear? Well, like the landscape of fear, the landscape of heat has spatial and temporal components. So obviously it's cooler in the morning and evening and at night than it is during the heat of the day. And we can also see very big differences in temperature across landscapes spatially, as illustrated by this thermal imaging camera photograph of an arid savanna in the bottom of the screen. We've already seen from our empirical research that Ophir showed you, that I showed you, that animals do shift their activity in relation to the risk of lethal dehydration and hypothermia, both in time and in space. And I would argue that this is analogous to animals shifting their time and space of their activity in response to the risk of death by predation. And it's also clear that different species will respond in different ways. So if we use the two bird species that I've spoken to you about today, the fork-tailed drongo seeks shade at temperatures above 28 degrees Celsius. So this bird is spending more than 50% of its time in the shade if the air temperature is higher than 28 degrees. For common fiscal shrikes, that temperature at which more than 50% of the time is spent in the shade is actually 35.7 degrees. So you can see that there are species-specific differences in the use of the thermal landscape. And that leads us to predict that these changes in behavior for thermoregulation as the climate warms is likely to decouple species interactions and create new ones, which could result in trophic cascades. And here is a quick possible example using again the fork-tailed drongo of a changed species interaction due to the landscape of heat. So I showed you those graphs showing that these birds forage and hunt more and feed the chicks more in the morning and evening on hotter days. And we think that this change in the timing of behavior carries with it an increased risk of predation associated with being active at times that other species in the system, such as these white-faced owls, are also active. And my PhD student sent me this little video just the other day showing one of our study birds being eaten by a white-faced owl during or after a bout of nest provisioning in the evening after a hot day. Okay, so where do we go to from here? Well, the ecosystem level impacts of behavioural changes for thermoregulation are really a new frontier for ecological research. I don't know of many studies on this topic. The best work I've seen so far is in fact Ophir's. However, we know from the landscape of fear literature that behavioural changes really matter. They can fundamentally shift ecosystems, even in the absence of catastrophic population reductions, and even in the absence of range shifts of animals. So it's not just about changes in relative abundance, it's also about changes in the timing and the space use of behaving animals. So I suggest that perhaps what we need to be thinking about now is using concepts from the landscape of fear to help us think about the landscape of heat and to help us build and test hypotheses regarding the impacts on ecosystem function of animal behavioural thermoregulation using this framework. We need to continue to collect empirical data on this, and we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the importance of behaviour in shaping climate change responses. It's very easy to be tempted to just look at patterns because they're easier to model, but this importance of behaviour, I think, is critical and easily overlooked. So I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on this. It's a fairly simple idea, I think, but I suspect it could be important, and I'd be keen to know whether you think as well that it might be an interesting thing to work on further. I'd like to thank the team that worked with me on the fork-tailed drongos and the team who worked with me on thermal ecophysiology, in particular my close colleague Andrew McKechnie, also those supporters who have funded us and worked with us, and our amazing field assistants. And thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Questions? We have time for questions. So you can either write in the chat that you want to ask a question, or raise your hands if you know how to do that. I mean, again, virtually. And while people, okay, like always, while people are thinking or digesting, I do have, again, it's half a question. It's about the idea that you're suggesting, which is, I think, is brilliant. What about, I mean, what do you know about the effects of the landscape of heat or the changes in temperature on the, I would say, not really dispersal, but more like the ranges of like the foraging ranges, or the how much these animals, these birds move, with the idea, or with the idea that, you know, if they are avoiding moving through extreme open areas or areas that are no longer viable for them, can this cause some sort of fragmentation or something like that, or separate populations, something like that?
Can these cause, I heard everything you said except the last sentence. I wonder if you could...
Can this cause some sort of fragmentation, or I don't know, separate, once it affects the movement, you know, causing avoidance of certain areas? Can this suddenly, you know, suddenly population that used to be connected suddenly are not?
Oh, wow, what a fantastic question. And I haven't thought about it closely at that kind of a scale of you know, at that kind of a spatial scale. At a smaller spatial scale within the home ranges of animals, I think that there's an important possibility that fragmenting their movement and keeping to shaded areas is likely to cause Ashmole's halo effects around thermal refugia. So cause the depletion of prey animals in the areas surrounding bushes, for example. In terms of moving through landscapes, I think in arid zones where vegetation is extremely sparse, that there is a risk of that. And already we see in the Kalahari that some species are restricted to riverbeds which are more wooded. And I think, I mean, potentially that's because of thermal refugia in those areas and not being able to island hop from refuge to refuge through hotter and more open habitats. It's a really interesting idea, and I think it's something that we could really look into and try and collect some data on.
Cool.
Thank you.
Joanne.
Did you observe some phenological change in the reproductive season, for example, because to try to escape to this heat landscape, one way is to move in the time and not in space?
Yeah, it's also a fantastic question. And the answer is that it's quite mixed. So in the systems where we work, productivity is highest in the hottest time of year because they're summer rainfall regions. So the hot deserts of Southern Africa tend to be summer rainfall regions. And so you only get that influx of primary productivity and insects for breeding at those hot times of year. And I think that that is a very constraining factor. So it's difficult for an arid zone bird to shift to breed earlier in the year the way a temperate zone bird might, because of that rainfall constraint. But having said that, some of the smaller passerine species seem to be more responsive in that way than the larger birds in these environments. So we do see shifts in breeding at the other end of the season. So sociable weavers, for example, will tend to breed and continue into the winter after these hot summers. Whereas bigger birds like hornbills are very constrained by the length of the nesting period as well. And so they'll only try the one time and they're stuck with when the rain is falling. So it's mixed.
Thanks. Claudia, do you have a question that you want to ask, or? Please do.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you hear me properly?
I can hear you, yes, thank you.
Okay. I would like to know from you, please, if is someone in your group working with predators?
Yes and no. I mean, all of the bird species we work with are predators. So, and especially the hornbills are predators of other vertebrates, but we're not specifically working on raptors. or on predators of vertebrates. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, my question was not very well posted to you. With carnivores, is someone in your group working with carnivores?
And not in our group, but I'm aware that Rosie Woodruff is working with wild dogs on some really similar questions. So she's got some fantastic data showing missed opportunity costs in wild dogs, which are really wonderful. I really recommend you read her papers. And we're missing data on mammals, really.
Yeah.
There's fewer research groups working on them. So, you know, encourage everybody you know who's interested in this stuff to work on mammals.
Okay. Thank you.
Usually it goes the other way around, you know, that most people go to mammals instinctive, really the first choice, and you need to encourage them to work on other things.
Yeah.
So it's actually refreshing to have also sometimes in some areas where it's the opposite. We're over time, but any last questions somebody has? So I will say that if you know, if some people want to talk after, because this hall might be used for something else, but there is a virtual hall that is for discussions. You can find it in between the halls of the conference so for discussions for this session. So you're always welcome there. And other than that, I want to say, I mean, I had a lot of fun. So I want to say thank you to the speakers. That was really, really great. And thank you for all that came here to listen and to ask questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference from wherever you are in the world. Goodbye.